depois tornarem-se I won't.
Olá, sou Jack Perkins. Bem-vindo a Biografias. Seja qual for o esporte, todos os grandes times de verdade parecem ter certas coisas básicas em comum. Provavelmente começaram com talento excepcional. Deve haver dedicação para desenvolver esse talento. E os grandes times têm capacidade de se concentrar e jogar como uma só unidade, para no momento decisivo acharem um modo de vencer de forma consistente. Hoje veremos uma franquia que tem tudo isso e algo mais que os outros times não têm. Eles são engraçados. Fazem rir pessoas de todas as idades, seja da Rússia até Roma. E vencem os melhores atletas que existem no mundo. Todos estão prestes a se tornar um dos mais famosos times de todos os tempos. Hoje em Biografias, aquele histórico conjunto de atletas, humoristas e coração, conhecido como os Harlem Globe. No final dos anos 20, os Big Five do Savoy perderam o seu lugar no Savoy e tiveram de ir para a estrada tentar um mundo que não raro era hostil aos negros. Mas com o passar dos anos, sua imaginação, paixão e habilidade lhes conquistou fãs em toda parte. Logo, nunca houve um lar para os Harlem Globe Troters. Eles fizeram do mundo o seu lar. Este é Biografias e eu sou Jack Perkins. Até a próxima vez.
By the very cunning of the seed, being struck so to the soul, presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. I'll have these players play some...
Subject is the mathematics of shuffling cards. It's a subject Professor Diaconis, almost a legend among magicians, knows very well. His dual careers as a mathematician and a magician are both intimately linked to Martin Gardner.
Martin's the reason I went back to college. I had dropped out of high school, actually, run away from home when I was 14 to go on the road doing magic. Certainly my interest in mathematics starts because of magic. That is, because of thinking about perfect shuffles and tricks with binary numbers and other things like that. And Martin's explaining to me, well, you know, you can understand that or develop a notation for it, or if you didn't only want to do it with red and black cards, if you wanted to do it with the 4 suits, you'd have to change the trick, but you could figure out how that goes. All of that just opened up a world for me.
Percy was extremely skillful with cards, with very difficult sleights, such as dealing the second card instead of the top card, dealing the bottom card, what they call second deals and bottom deals, and false cuts and false shuffles and so on. And actually, at that time, he was paying his way through NYU by working as a gambler on ships that went back and forth between New York and South America. And of course, nobody suspected this young teenage boy having this tremendous ability with cards.
Cards can be shuffled perfectly. That is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and what that involves is cutting the deck exactly in half and interweaving them together. And actually, it's a fact of nature or mathematics that it takes 8 shuffles to bring a deck back to where it started. That's surprising to people, and I still find it wonderful. They look as if they're being shuffled. One more, and I'm home. So that last shuffle, it should be that the cards are absolutely in order. I hope so. But it should be that all of the cards are. Yeah, it seems to have worked at least this time. Why would somebody be interested in doing that? Well, for example, if you were a gambler and you had 13 spades on top of the deck, so if, here they are on top of the deck, and if I shuffle them perfectly, the spades are every other card, okay? If I shuffle them perfectly again, they're every fourth card. So if I deal 4 bridge hands, I get all the spades, okay? So you can understand that gamblers had a keen interest, and the first published literature about perfect shuffling, which is in the 1720s, is gamblers writing to warn other gamblers about people who were shuffling cards perfectly and stuff like that. And magicians also are interested in perfect shuffles because obviously you can do tricks.
I knew the head of the statistics department at Harvard because he was another magic buff who had contributed a lot of items to magic and had been on the cover of magic magazines. And so I wrote to him and said that there's this friend of mine who's just graduated at NYU and wants to get into the math department at Harvard, and could you help him out? And I said, by the way, he does the finest second deal of anybody that I've ever met.
Fred's one of the great expositors of statistics and serious statisticians. And he took Martin's letter seriously, and he said, Martin wouldn't say this unless it's true, and I think we should give this kid a chance. And over the, complaints of other people, because I wasn't very well prepared. My grades were lousy. You're going to take a kid in a graduate program who has C, C, and D as his calculus grades? I mean...
Of course, they got along very well with the deck of cards between them, going over card magic and card sleights. So that's how Percy got into Harvard.
That only happened because of that link between Martin, mathematics, and magic, and Fred Mosteller. And Fred, Fred never told me that story until I graduated. And then afterwards, he said, I just want to tell you something, show you something. How'd you get into Harvard? And so, I mean, that's making a difference in somebody's life. And just knowing that the ace of spades is on the bottom, the distance to uniformity is equal to, 1 minus 1 over n.
It's not every high school dropout who ends up teaching at Harvard or having his lectures broadcast to mathematicians all over the world live on the internet. Martin Gardner's network requires neither modems nor fiber optic cables. What it lacks in technical sophistication is more than made up by its complex human interconnections. A senior member of that network is Professor Coxeter of the University of Toronto.
One of these is called intuition, and it involved putting together 3 hollow triangles, putting them together in the manner of Borromean rings. As you see here, for instance, the red triangle goes through the blue triangle, but if the yellow triangle were not there, you could pull them apart.
How did you first become acquainted with Martin Gardner?
I think it was through reading the little article he always had in the Scientific American on mathematical games. I found that was very intriguing. But then my popular book was published, Introduction to Geometry, and got in correspondence with him.
At a time when the Dutch artist M.C. Escher was virtually unknown in North America, Professor Coxeter used his works to illustrate certain problems in geometry. Because of Coxeter's influence, Martin dedicated a column to the art of M.C. Escher. The interactions between Coxeter, Escher, and Martin were to lead to results no one would have imagined. How did you first learn about Escher?
I first heard about him from Professor Coxeter, a very famous geometer at the University of Toronto. And he put me in touch with Escher, and I wrote a column about him for Scientific American. And we exchanged quite a number of letters, and I asked him if he had any pictures for sale, and I bought this from him for $60. And that was before he became famous. The art critics don't care about his work at all, but mathematicians, of course, are enormously fond of Escher because his work ties up with so many interesting mathematical concepts.
One of those concepts that concerned Escher was what mathematicians call tiling the plane. That's the question of what shape tiles can fill a flat surface without gaps or overlaps. Obviously, square tiles can, and circular tiles can't. But what about more complex shapes? Escher's interest in this question is shared by mathematicians, crystallographers, and artisans. Professor Doris Schatzschneider is a mathematician, an Escher scholar, and a friend of Martin Gardner.
Escher seemed to be absolutely fascinated by tiling and by making up his own rules for tilings. They had to be creature-shaped, they had to be recognizable, they had to be colored in such a way that each tile stood out by itself, and so on. And he worked out his own, what he called his layman's theory, and he discovered an enormous amount.
In the correspondence that he received about these articles on tiling was a letter that he forwarded to Professor Schatzschneider.
And in February 1976, he sent me something that had come in from Marjorie Rice in San Diego. I had no idea who she was.
Professor Schatzschneider was soon to discover that Marjorie Rice was no academic. She was a housewife who, along with her husband Gilbert, was raising 5 children in Southern California.
It wasn't until my senior year of high school that when I took a general mathematics course that I really found out how much I had been missing and how much I liked it. But I only had that 1 year and then I graduated.
Marjorie had purchased a subscription to Scientific American for her youngest son. But when she had finished her housework, she would turn her attention to Martin's column.
I first discovered my interest in this when Martin Gardner wrote about the 8 types of pentagon tiling in his column. And I thought, my, that must be wonderful that someone could discover these things which nobody had seen before, these beautiful patterns. So I started figuring out some way to work on the problem. I studied all of the types that were pictured in the articles and tried to discover a new type. And I was so delighted when I found it. I couldn't believe it. I didn't really think I would find anything. I just was so thrilled. And I sent it to Martin Gardner, and he sent it to Doris Schatzschneider.
Based on Marjorie's new tilings, Professor Schatzschneider proposed a rule about tilings in general. Though unschooled in higher math, Marjorie was able to prove the expert wrong by showing that this rule didn't hold.
Her proof was no proof like anything I had ever seen before. In fact, it was a series of pictures, all encoded with little marks. She did not use mathematical notation. She had little schematic pentagons drawn with little chicken track marks in them. And I really had no idea what all this meant. Finally, I figured out her intuition was exactly right, but she didn't have the mathematical tools to prove it herself. She ended up contributing to all kinds of new tilings by pentagons that had never been seen before. She seems just unstoppable. But her story really wouldn't exist if it hadn't been Martin Gardner's column.
Watch this, young lady. Fingertips on top of table. Table will follow the fingertips into the air, defying the laws of gravity and impressing an impressionable young miss. How it's done in a moment. It's magic, all right, but the table is helped along in its rise by a couple rulers the boys have stuck up their sleeves and under the table edge. You can choose a variety of weapons, but ordinary rulers will do.